before the pyramids, before cities, before writing, before kings, there was a hill, and on that hill, people built something they had no practical reason to build. They were not farmers. They had no metal tools. They left no written explanation. Yet they returned here for generations, and then, one day, they buried it. This is the story of Göbekli Tepe. There was a time before cities, before walls divided the landscape into territories, before roads connected distant places, before kings claimed authority, and before scribes pressed symbols into wet clay. Human life moved differently then, not slower in the way we often imagine, but according to rhythms that belonged to the land itself. People followed the movement of animals across open plains. They gathered wild plants when the season allowed. They rested where water could be found and moved on when resources became scarce. Nothing was designed to last forever. Shelters were temporary. Tools were carried. Possessions remained few. The world was not organized around permanence. It was organized around movement. For thousands of years, this way of life had worked remarkably well. Small groups crossed vast landscapes. Knowledge was passed through memory rather than writing. The changing seasons provided structure. The stars offered orientation. The land itself served as both guide and teacher. To modernize, this world can appear fragile, but it was not. It was adaptable. A community that could move was often stronger than one tied to a single place. Movement allowed people to respond to drought, changing weather, and shifting animal migrations. Flexibility was survival. And yet, within this mobile world, something unexpected happened. At a hilltop in what is now southeastern Turkey, people began returning to the same place again and again. Not for shelter, not because a river flowed nearby, not because the soil was especially fertile. The hill offered no obvious advantage. It was simply there, quiet, open, unremarkable, and still they returned. Imagine standing on that hill more than 11,000 years ago. The air is cool before sunrise. The horizon stretches endlessly in every direction. No cities break the landscape. No roads cross the plains. No towers rise in the distance. Only rolling hills, scattered vegetation, and the vast sky above. The world feels larger than it does today, not because the land itself is different, but because so little has been imposed upon it. Every direction feels open. Every path remains possible. As the first light appears, small groups begin arriving. Some have traveled for days. Others have come from nearby valleys. They approach without ceremony. There are no gates, no walls, no guards controlling entry. The hill belongs to no one, and yet everyone seems to recognize it. No written map guides them here. No marker announces the destination. Memory is enough. They have come before. Their parents came before them, perhaps even their grandparents. The journey itself has become part of a familiar rhythm. Arrival does not feel like discovery. It feels like return. That distinction matters. Returning creates a relationship the settlement does not. A settlement claims a place. A return acknowledges it. The people gathering here do not intend to stay forever. When the gathering ends, they will leave again. The hill will remain behind. The relationship is temporary, yet enduring. And this is where the mystery begins. Because these people are not farmers. Agriculture has not yet transformed the region. Fields do not surround the hill. Domesticated animals do not fill fenced enclosures. There are no villages stretching across the landscape. The social structures we normally associate with large construction projects do not yet exist, at least not in the forms we recognize. Yet something extraordinary is about to happen. Stone will be cut, stone will be shaped, stone will be moved. Not one piece, not 10, but many. Massive limestone pillars weighing several tons each. The effort required is difficult to ignore. Even today, moving such stones demands planning and coordination. 11,000 years ago, it demanded even more. And perhaps that is what makes Göbekli Tepe so fascinating. The stones themselves are impressive. But the greater question is not how they were raised, it is why. Why would communities whose lives depended on mobility invest so much effort into a place they did not inhabit permanently? Why return to the same hill generation after generation? Why create something designed to remain when their own lives were defined by movement? For more than a century, historians believed they understood the order of human civilization. First came agriculture, then villages, then permanent settlements, then monuments and ritual centers. It seemed logical. People settled first and built later, but Göbekli Tepe quietly challenges that assumption. Here we find evidence of large-scale construction before the rise of cities, before organized states, before writing, before nearly everything we normally place at the beginning of civilization. The implications are difficult to overstate. Perhaps people did not gather because they had settled. Perhaps they settled because they had learned how to gather. Perhaps the desire to come together was not the result of civilization. Perhaps it was one of the forces that created it. We cannot know for certain. The stones do not provide answers. They offer no inscriptions, no explanations, no declarations of purpose, only presence. And so, rather than forcing conclusions upon them, we will do something simpler. We will slow down. We will observe the landscape, the people, the stone, the rhythm of return. We will look carefully at what can be known and allow uncertainty to remain where it belongs. Because Göbekli Tepe is not merely a story about ancient construction. It is a story about a world standing at the edge of transformation, a world that had not yet become the one we know. And on a quiet hill above the plains, that transformation was already beginning. For thousands of years, the hill remained silent. Wind crossed its slopes. Rain fell upon the stones. Seasons arrived and departed without leaving records behind. The people who had once gathered there were gone. Their fires had faded. Their footsteps had disappeared. And beneath the earth, hidden from sight, the great pillars waited. Centuries passed, then millennia. Empires rose and vanished. Languages were born and forgotten. Entire civilizations appeared across the Near East, flourished, and disappeared into history. Yet the hill remained. From a distance, there was nothing extraordinary about it. No towering ruins, no standing walls, no monuments visible against the horizon. Only a gentle rise in the landscape, a place easily overlooked. And for a very long time, it was. Local farmers knew the hill. They crossed it during daily work. They noticed unusual stones emerging from the soil. Fragments of worked limestone occasionally appeared after ploughing. But strange stones are not uncommon in ancient lands. The region is filled with traces of forgotten settlements. No one imagined what rested beneath the surface. In the 1960s, researchers visited the area as part of a survey. They documented the site. They noted the visible stones, but they reached the wrong conclusion. The hill was classified as a medieval cemetery. The stones were considered ordinary grave markers. Nothing suggested a discovery that would transform our understanding of prehistory, and so the hill returned to silence. For decades, it waited, not hidden deliberately, simply unnoticed. Sometimes the most important discoveries do not remain concealed because they are difficult to find. They remain concealed because no one yet knows what they are looking at. Then, in the 1990s, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt encountered the survey records. Something immediately caught his attention. The descriptions did not match his expectations. The stones sounded unusual. The location felt significant. He decided to visit the site himself. When he arrived, the realization came quickly. The limestone fragments scattered across the surface were not random. They had been shaped, worked, moved, placed by human hands. The hill was not a cemetery. It was something far older, something far stranger. Schmidt later described the feeling as immediate. He understood that this was not a small archaeological site. The scale was obvious. The worked stone visible on the surface suggested that enormous structures remained buried underneath. What he could not yet know was just how old those structures would prove to be. Excavations began. Slowly, carefully. Archaeology is often imagined as a dramatic process of discovery, but most excavations begin with patience, a few centimeters of soil removed at a time, a few stones exposed, a few clues emerging from darkness. At Göbekli Tepe, the first results were astonishing. Massive T-shaped pillars appeared beneath the earth. Then more, then more. Each discovery suggested something larger waiting below. The deeper archaeologists looked, the more extraordinary the site became. These were not isolated stones. They belonged to carefully planned enclosures. The pillars had been shaped deliberately. Some carried animal carvings. Others displayed human-like features. Everything suggested intention. Everything suggested organization. And yet the dates seemed impossible. Radiocarbon analysis pushed the site further and further back into time. Far beyond cities, far beyond writing, far beyond monuments previously thought to represent the beginning of civilization. Suddenly, accepted timelines no longer felt secure. The traditional story had been simple. People settled. Agriculture developed. Villages formed. Then came large-scale construction. Göbekli Tepe challenged that sequence. Here was evidence of monumental building before many of those developments. The implications spread far beyond archaeology. If people could organize labor on this scale before cities existed, what else might we misunderstand about the ancient world? Questions multiplied. Answers arrived slowly. Even today, only a small percentage of the site has been excavated. Most of the hill remains untouched. What has already been revealed is extraordinary. What remains hidden may be even more remarkable. Yet perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the discovery is how close the site came to remaining unnoticed. A farmer's field, a few stones, an overlooked survey, a quiet hill beneath the Anatolian sky. History often feels inevitable when viewed from a distance, but it rarely is. Sometimes understanding changes because one person asks a different question. Sometimes the past survives because no one disturbed it, and sometimes an ancient place waits 11,000 years for someone to recognize what it has been holding all along. The hill had never disappeared. The stones had never left. They had simply been resting beneath the earth, waiting patiently while the world changed above them. And when they finally emerged again, they brought with them a story far older than anyone expected. A story that begins long before civilization. A story written not in words, but in stone. Long before cities appeared, long before roads connected distant settlements, the land around Göbekli Tepe belonged to a different world. It was neither completely wild nor fully shaped by human hands. People lived within it rather than above it. They adapted to its rhythms. They listened to its changes, and they followed its opportunities wherever they appeared. To understand Göbekli Tepe, we must first understand this world, because the stones did not emerge in isolation. They emerged from a landscape already rich with life. 11,000 years ago, southeastern Anatolia looked different from today. The climate was changing. The great cold periods of the Ice Age were fading into memory. Temperatures slowly rose. Rainfall patterns shifted. Grasslands expanded across the region. Wild plants flourished. Animal populations increased. The land entered a period of opportunity. Yet this transition was not immediate. Nature rarely changes all at once. For generations, people lived through uncertainty. They adapted continuously to shifting conditions. One year might bring abundance, another could bring scarcity. Survival depended not on controlling the environment, but on understanding it. Knowledge was everything. Knowing where water collected after seasonal rains, knowing when particular plants became edible, knowing which valleys attracted migrating animals. This knowledge was not written down, it existed within memory. Parents taught children, elders shared experience. Entire communities carried generations of observation in their minds. The landscape itself became a living archive. Among the most important resources were wild cereals. Long before agriculture, the hills and valleys of the region supported naturally growing stands of wild wheat and barley. These plants were not cultivated. No one planted them. No one irrigated them. Yet they appeared year after year. Their abundance attracted attention. People learned when they ripened. They learned how to gather them efficiently. They learned how to process and store them. The relationship was still fundamentally different from farming. Nature remained in control. Humans harvested opportunity rather than creating it. But a foundation was forming. Knowledge accumulated. Observation deepened. Possibilities expanded. Animals also shaped life across the region. Among the most important were gazelles. Large herds crossed the landscape seasonally. Their migrations provided food, hides, bones, and materials essential for daily survival. Communities watched these movements carefully. A successful hunt could support many people. A failed hunt carried consequences. Patience became a skill. Observation became a necessity. The rhythm of life followed the movement of animals more closely than any calendar. Alongside gazelles lived wild cattle, boars, foxes, birds, and countless smaller creatures. Many would later appear carved upon the pillars of Göbekli Tepe. This connection matters. The carvings did not emerge from imagination alone. They emerged from familiarity. The animals represented daily encounters with the living world. People knew their behavior, their movements, their habits. The landscape was shared, not dominated. Shared. This distinction is important. Modern society often separates humanity from nature. We build barriers. We create boundaries. We establish distance. For the people of Göbekli Tepe's era, such separation did not exist. The environment was not something outside their lives. It was their lives. Every decision depended upon it. Every journey responded to it. Every season revealed new challenges and opportunities. Movement remained central. Groups rarely stayed in one location for extended periods. Mobility provided resilience. When resources declined, people moved. When opportunities appeared elsewhere, they followed. This flexibility reduced risk. It allowed adaptation without requiring large permanent settlements. The concept of home itself may have been very different. Home was not necessarily a building. Home could be a route, a familiar valley, a seasonal gathering place, a landscape remembered through experience. This way of life required cooperation. No individual possessed all necessary knowledge. Communities shared information constantly, where animals had been seen, where water remained available, which plants were thriving. Collective memory increased survival. Trust became valuable. Relationships mattered. People depended on one another. These connections likely extended across surprisingly large distances. Groups encountered one another repeatedly. Knowledge traveled. Ideas traveled. Skills traveled. The world may have been more connected than we often assume. And somewhere within this network of movement and memory, Göbekli Tepe began to emerge as a place of significance. Not because it controlled resources, not because it offered protection, but because it offered something different. A place where people could gather. A place where familiar faces could reappear after months apart. A place where stories could be shared, where knowledge could circulate, where relationships could be renewed. The hill stood quietly within a landscape already full of meaning. It did not create community. It gave community a place to return. As the climate improved and resources became more abundant, gatherings may have become larger, more frequent, more ambitious. People had opportunities that earlier generations lacked. Time could occasionally be invested in activities beyond immediate survival. This does not mean life became easy. It remained demanding. Every season still carried uncertainty. Every journey still involved risk. But small surpluses create possibilities. A successful season can produce more than food. It can produce ideas. It can create opportunities for cooperation. It can allow people to imagine projects larger than themselves. Perhaps this was the true foundation of Göbekli Tepe, not agriculture, not hierarchy, not political power, but opportunity. A moment in human history when environmental conditions, social networks, and collective knowledge aligned. A moment when people could gather not only because they had to survive, but because they wanted to come together. The stones had not yet been raised. The great enclosures did not yet exist, but the world that would create them was already taking shape. Across the hills, wild grasses moved with the wind. Gazelles crossed the plains. Small groups traveled familiar routes. Fires glowed briefly beneath the stars before fading into darkness. And slowly, almost invisibly, a new chapter of human history was beginning. No one could have known what would follow. No one could have imagined that a hill overlooking the landscape would one day challenge our understanding of civilization itself. Yet the conditions were already there, waiting, growing, aligning. The world, before farming, was not a primitive beginning. It was a complete world of its own. A world of movement, memory, observation, and connection. And from that world, Göbekli Tepe would soon emerge. Of all the questions surrounding Göbekli Tepe, one remains more difficult than the rest. Why did people keep coming back? The stones themselves are impressive. Their size attracts attention. Their carvings inspire curiosity. But before any stone was raised, before any enclosure existed, there was already a pattern. People returned, again and again, generation after generation. The true mystery may not be the construction, it may be the return. Imagine the landscape thousands of years ago. A small group travels across the plains. They move through territory they know well. The hills are familiar, the valleys familiar, the stars above familiar. Nothing about the journey feels unusual, and yet their destination is always the same. a hill that offers no permanent water source, no extraordinary shelter, no obvious strategic advantage. Still they come. The decision appears irrational only from a modern perspective. Today we often travel because we must, for work, for trade, for survival, for obligation. The people who gathered at Göbekli Tepe may have been motivated by something much older, the simple human desire to come together. In a world built upon movement, separation was normal. Groups spent months apart. Entire seasons might pass without seeing familiar faces. People followed different herds, different resources, different opportunities. Distance was expected, and because separation was expected, reunion carried meaning. Imagine arriving after months away. You recognize people before you reach them. A familiar voice, a familiar face, someone you hunted with years ago, someone who taught you a skill, someone who shared stories around a fire during another season. The gathering becomes more than practical. It becomes social, emotional, human. Imagine the hill during one of these gatherings. The journey is over. The fires have been lit. Voices carry across the evening air. Children run between small groups of travelers. Hunters compare stories from distant valleys. Elders share memories of previous seasons. The gathering feels familiar, not because everyone knows one another, because everyone knows the place. The hill has become part of their lives, a fixed point within a moving world, and each return strengthens the bond a little more. Not between people and stone, between people and memory. Perhaps this is why the hill mattered, not because of what it provided, but because of what happened there. The place itself may have acted as an anchor within a constantly moving world, not a home, not a settlement, something different, a point of return. Göbekli Tepe was not necessarily important because people built monuments there. People may have built monuments there because the place was already important. The gathering came first. The stones came later. This possibility transforms the story entirely. Instead of asking why people built Göbekli Tepe, we begin asking why they gathered. And suddenly the question becomes easier to understand. Human beings are social creatures. They share knowledge. They build relationships. They create traditions. Even the smallest communities depend upon cooperation. Gatherings strengthen those connections. Knowledge could be exchanged. News could travel. Skills could spread. Young people could meet individuals from distant groups. Stories could move across the landscape. A gathering became a network. A place where separate communities briefly became one. This alone might have justified the journey. Children arrived with parents. Years later, they returned as adults. Eventually, they brought children of their own. The hill became woven into the rhythm of life. Arrival no longer felt like discovery. It felt like return, and return became tradition. The place was remembered not because it was owned, but because it was shared. Nothing about the archaeological evidence suggests strict exclusion. No walls protected the hill from outsiders. No fortifications controlled access. The site appears open, accessible, welcoming. Its importance seems collective rather than exclusive. And perhaps that collective importance explains the extraordinary effort that would eventually follow. Because once a place becomes deeply meaningful, people begin investing in it, not for practical gain, for continuity, for memory, for belonging. The first stones may have emerged from this impulse, a way of giving physical form to something already existing within the community, a way of marking a place that had long served as a point of return. The monuments did not create the gathering, they reflected it. The hill had already become important. The stones simply made that importance visible. Modern technology has changed our lives. Cities have changed our lives. Civilization has changed our lives. But gathering remains important. We still travel great distances to meet one another. We still create places of shared meaning. We still return to locations connected with memory. The scale has changed. The tools have changed. The world has changed. The impulse remains. And somewhere beneath the stones of Göbekli Tepe, that ancient impulse can still be felt. Not the desire to build, not the desire to control, but the desire to return. Long before civilization learned how to construct cities, it had already learned something equally important: how to gather. And on a quiet hill overlooking the plains of Anatolia, people returned often enough that stone itself would eventually become part of the tradition. The gathering came first, the monuments followed, and everything that happened afterward began with a simple decision repeated across generations. To come back. At some point, an idea became action. For generations, people had gathered on the hill. They had returned with the seasons. They had shared stories, knowledge, and experience. But now something different was beginning, something physical, something that would leave a mark upon the landscape. The decision may have seemed simple at first: a stone, then another, then another. Yet every great undertaking begins this way. Not with a monument, but with a choice. Someone looked to the limestone ridge beneath the hill and saw possibility. Not shelter, not a tool, something larger, something meant to remain. The stone itself was everywhere. The hills surrounding Göbekli Tepe were formed largely from soft limestone, easy enough to shape compared to harder rock, difficult enough to demand effort. The material waited beneath the surface, hidden but abundant. Even today, traces of the ancient quarries remain visible. Archaeologists have identified unfinished pillars still attached to bedrock, frozen in the moment of creation, a project interrupted thousands of years ago. These unfinished stones reveal something important. The builders were not experimenting. They knew exactly what they wanted. The T-shaped pillars appear repeatedly throughout the site. The proportions remain remarkably consistent. This suggests planning, not improvisation, not accident. A shared design repeated again and again. Imagine the work required. Stone tools striking limestone. Hour after hour. Day after day. The sound echoing across the hill. Dust rising into the air. Fragments falling away. Slowly, a shape emerging from solid rock. Nothing happened quickly. Every surface required attention. Every edge demanded patience. The people responsible for this work possessed knowledge developed across generations. They understood stone. They understood fracture lines. They understood pressure. Skill existed long before writing, long before formal engineering. Knowledge did not need books to survive. It lived in hands, in observation, in repetition. Eventually, the pillars separated from the bedrock, but creation had only reached its halfway point. Now came the greater challenge: movement. Some pillars weighed several tons. Even modern visitors struggle to comprehend their scale. Standing beside them creates a different understanding. Photographs flatten size. Reality restores it. These stones were enormous, and yet they moved. No wheels existed. No draft animals pulled heavy loads. No metal tools assisted the process. Only people, rope, wood, coordination, and determination. Exactly how the builders transported the pillars remains uncertain. Archaeologists continue debating the details. But uncertainty about method should not distract from certainty about achievement. The stones arrived. That fact alone matters. Somehow communities organized enough labor to move immense blocks of limestone from quarry to enclosure. The process must have required cooperation on a remarkable scale. One person could not do it. 10 people could not do it. Dozens may have worked together. Perhaps more. Movement required coordination. Coordination required communication. Communication required shared purpose. This may be one of the most important lessons of Göbekli Tepe. The builders were not isolated individuals. They were communities acting together. For a long time, historians assumed that large-scale cooperation emerged only after agriculture and permanent settlement. Göbekli Tepe suggests otherwise. People were capable of extraordinary coordination long before cities existed. The stones prove it. Imagine the moment of transport. Voices calling instructions. Ropes pulled tight. Wooden supports creaking beneath tremendous weight. Dust rising beneath countless footsteps. Progress measured not in distance, but in effort. A few meters gained. A pause, then a few more. The work demanded patience. No urgency pushed the builders forward. The stones were not required for survival. No storm approached. No enemy threatened. The project existed because people chose to continue. That choice may be the most remarkable aspect of all. Once the pillars reached the enclosure, another challenge began. Raising them. A pillar lying on the ground is impressive. A pillar standing upright transforms space. Verticality changes perception. It alters the horizon. It commands attention. The builders understood this. The T-shaped pillars were not scattered randomly. They were positioned deliberately, often facing inward, often arranged around central stones larger than the others. The layout created structure without walls, an enclosure without enclosure, a defined space without complete separation from the landscape. As the pillars rose, the hill itself began changing. For generations, the gathering place had been recognized through memory. Now it could be recognized through stone. The horizon itself was different. Where open sky had existed, pillars now stood, silent, watchful, permanent, perhaps for the first time. Visitors approaching the hill could see human intention expressed at monumental scale. Not a camp, not temporary shelter, something designed to remain, something waiting between gatherings, something that continued existing even after people departed. The psychological effect must have been powerful. Every return revealed the same pillars, the same forms, the same arrangement. Memory acquired a physical anchor. The gathering no longer depended entirely on recollection. The landscape itself now participated. Stone remembered. The builders also invested time in decoration. Animals appeared upon the surfaces. Foxes, snakes, birds, boars, creatures familiar to daily life. The carvings transformed the pillars from construction into expression, not merely stones. Meaningful stones, not merely architecture, something more difficult to define. And perhaps that difficulty is intentional. The pillars resist simple categories. They are not houses. They are not defensive structures. They are not practical infrastructure. Their purpose appears connected to gathering itself, to memory, to presence, to shared experience. As the years passed, new enclosures appeared, new pillars rose, additional labor was invested. The project expanded, not rapidly, not explosively, but steadily. Generation after generation, this continuity matters. Göbekli Tepe was not created during a single moment. It evolved across centuries. Each generation inherited what previous generations had begun. Each generation contributed something of its own. The hill became a conversation across time, stone linking people who would never meet. The builders never left written explanations. No inscription tells us what they believed. No text records their intentions. The stones remain silent. Yet silence should not be mistaken for absence. The evidence is all around us: the quarries, the pillars, the carvings, the enclosures. Every surface speaks of effort. Every pillar speaks of cooperation. Every enclosure speaks of return. The achievement was not merely architectural. It was social. Human beings gathering often enough, trusting one another enough, and cooperating long enough to reshape an entire hill. That achievement remains extraordinary even today. And as the pillars rose higher above the landscape, another mystery slowly emerged. Why were these stones shaped like human beings? Why did they possess arms and hands? Why did they stand upright like silent figures watching over the gathering place? To answer those questions, we must look more closely at the pillars themselves. The pillars of Göbekli Tepe are often described as stones. Technically, this is true. They are limestone, cut from bedrock, shaped by human hands, raised through extraordinary effort, but standing among them, it becomes difficult to think of them as mere stones. The reason becomes clearer when we look closely. At first glance, the T-shaped pillars appear abstract, simple geometric forms rising from the ground, but then details begin to emerge. Along the sides of several pillars, carved arms descend toward the front, hands meet near the lower section, belts appear round the waist. In some cases, animal skins seem to hang from the body. The realization arrives slowly. These are not simply pillars, they are figures, not realistic figures, not portraits, but representations of something human-like. And suddenly the sight feels different. The stones are no longer only architecture. They become images, symbols, representations of beings whose identities remain unknown. Yet one feature remains strangely absent. Faces, there are no eyes, no mouths, no noses, no expressions. The figures possess bodies, but not faces. Presence without identity, form without individuality. This absence may be the most intriguing feature of all. Throughout history, faces have carried enormous importance. They communicate emotion, authority, recognition. They distinguish one individual from another. The builders of Göbekli Tepe clearly possessed the skill to carve detail. The animal reliefs prove this beyond doubt. If faces are missing, it is not because the builders lacked ability. The omission was deliberate. Why remove identity? Why create figures that resemble people but refuse to become people? The answer remains unknown. Perhaps individual identity was not the focus. Perhaps the figures represented something larger than any single person. Ancestors, spirits, mythological beings, protective forces, representations of the gathered community itself. Many interpretations have been proposed. None can be proven. The stones remain silent. Yet the arrangement of the figures offers another clue. Most of the pillars face inward, toward the center of the enclosure, toward one another. The design feels intentional. The figures seem connected, not to visitors, to the space itself. And at the center of many enclosures stand the larger pillars, taller, heavier, more imposing. Everything around them appears organized in relation to these central forms. The hierarchy is visible. The identity is not. This combination creates mystery, importance without explanation, presence without narrative. The central pillars dominate the enclosure, yet they remain as anonymous as every other figure. No names, no titles, no symbols of rank, only scale. And scale alone is enough to suggest significance. Modern minds often seek labels. We want categories, definitions, certainty. The builders of Göbekli Tepe left none. The figures resist classification. They exist somewhere between sculpture and architecture, between symbol and being, between the human and the unknown. Perhaps this ambiguity was intentional. A named figure becomes fixed. A faceless figure remains open. Every generation can encounter it differently. Every visitor can imagine something different standing before them. There is another reason these pillars feel unusual. They do not tell stories. Most ancient art captures action. A hunt, a battle, a ritual, a victory. The figures of Göbekli Tepe do none of these things. They simply stand, and somehow that stillness creates power. The pillars do not demand attention, yet they quietly receive it. Visitors naturally look toward them, measure themselves against them, wonder about them. The figures never explain themselves. They simply remain, and perhaps that is why they continue to fascinate us. For more than 11,000 years they have offered the same silent invitation. Look closer, ask questions, imagine possibilities, but do not expect certainty. Whatever these figures represented, one fact remains undeniable. The builders invested tremendous effort in creating them. Enough effort to quarry the stone, enough effort to carve it, enough effort to transport and raise it, again and again, across generations. The figures mattered. Exactly why, we may never know. Yet they stand as some of the earliest large-scale human representations ever created, silent, faceless, unnamed, and still capable of capturing our attention thousands of years later. Yet the figures were not alone. Across their surfaces appeared another world entirely, a world of foxes, snakes, birds, boars, creatures carved with remarkable precision. If the pillars represent the mystery of humanity, the animals represent the living landscape that surrounded it, and together they form one of the most extraordinary visual worlds of the ancient age. Long before written language, human beings observed the world around them with extraordinary attention. Survival depended upon it. A missed track could mean a lost hunt. A forgotten migration route could mean hunger. The people who gathered at Göbekli Tepe lived within a landscape filled with animals. They shared the same hills, the same valleys, the same seasons. Every day brought encounters with living creatures. When the builders began carving the great pillars, these animals came with them, not as decoration, but as part of the world they knew. Across the stones, animals appear everywhere. Foxes move along pillar surfaces. Snakes twist across limestone. Birds spread their wings. Wild boars emerge from the rock. Together, they create one of the oldest surviving galleries of animal life ever discovered. Yet something immediately stands out. The animals are not shown in dramatic scenes. There are no hunts, no battles, no stories unfolding across the stone. Each creature exists on its own, alert, distinct, important. The builders clearly wanted the animals themselves to be seen. Among all the creatures represented at Göbekli Tepe, foxes appear especially often. This is surprising. Foxes were neither the largest nor the most dangerous animals of the region. Yet they appear again and again. Perhaps they carried symbolic importance. Perhaps they appeared in stories now lost to time. Or perhaps they were simply familiar companions within the landscape. The stones do not tell us. They only preserve the pattern. Snakes appear frequently as well. Their bodies curve elegantly across the pillars, sometimes alone, sometimes grouped together. Even today, snakes inspire strong reactions, but we must be careful not to project later beliefs backward into a much older world. What we know is simple. The builders saw these animals often enough and considered them important enough to carve them repeatedly into stone. Birds occupy a special place among the carvings. Many researchers have focused on the large birds, often interpreted as vultures. These creatures would have been a familiar sight above the plains, circling high overhead, visible from great distances, part of everyday life in the ancient landscape. Their presence connected earth and sky in a way few other animals could. Wild boars also appear, powerful animals, difficult to hunt, dangerous when cornered. The carvings capture that strength remarkably well, compact, solid, confident, yet perhaps the most important observation is not which animals appear. It is how they appear. The carvings suggest no clear hierarchy. The animals are not shown beneath humans. They are not shown serving humans. They are not reduced to symbols of ownership or control. Instead, they exist alongside the human figures, sharing the same visual world. This is a striking difference from many later civilizations. In much of recorded history, humanity stands at the center. Nature exists around it. Göbekli Tepe feels different. Humans and animals seem to belong to the same landscape, the same reality, the same story. The builders did not carve themselves as masters of nature. They carved themselves within nature, part of a living environment rather than separate from it. This may explain why the site still feels unusual today. It presents a vision of the world that is both ancient and strangely familiar. A world where people watched animals closely, learned from them, depended upon them, respected them. The carvings preserve that relationship, not as scientific observation, not as written history, but as memory made visible, a record without words, a gallery without names, a landscape preserved in stone. Even after 11,000 years, the animals remain recognizable. A fox catches the eye. A snake commands attention. A bird invites curiosity. The connection survives. We may not fully understand what the carvings meant, but we immediately understand that they mattered. And perhaps that is enough. The animals never explain themselves, neither do the pillars. Yet together they create a visual language unlike anything else from their age, a language of observation, a language of memory, a language shaped by a world where humans and animals shared the same horizon. And beyond the carvings lies another question. If people invested generations of labor into this place, if communities continued returning century after century, what exactly happened here? To explore that mystery, we must turn from stone to ritual, from what was carved to what was experienced. By the time the great enclosures stood upon the hill, Göbekli Tepe had become more than a place. It had become an experience. People traveled long distances to reach it. They invested labor in maintaining it. They returned generation after generation. Such commitment raises an unavoidable question. What happened here? The honest answer is simple. We do not know. No written records survive. No inscriptions explain the ceremonies. No voices remain to describe the gatherings. The people who stood among these pillars left behind stone, but not instructions. And yet the absence of certainty does not mean the absence of clues. Archaeology rarely provides complete stories. Instead, it offers fragments, patterns, traces. From those traces, a picture slowly begins to emerge. Evidence suggests that large groups gathered at Göbekli Tepe. This alone is significant. Bringing together many people required planning. Food had to be available. Water had to be accessible. Time had to be set aside. The gathering itself became an event. And events create memory. Excavations have uncovered enormous quantities of animal bones. Gazelle remains are especially common. So are the remains of wild cattle and other animals. Many archaeologists interpret this evidence as a sign of communal feasting. If true, the gatherings may have involved shared meals on a scale rarely seen among hunter-gatherer societies. Imagine the scene. Groups arriving from different directions, fires appearing across the hill, the sounds of conversation spreading through the evening air, food prepared and shared among hundreds of people, stories exchanged, news carried across great distances, relationships renewed. The gathering becomes more than practical. It becomes ceremonial, not because anyone declares it so, because shared experience naturally creates meaning. Modern people often associate ritual with religion. Temples, priests, sacred texts, formal ceremonies, but ritual is older than all of these things. At its simplest, ritual is repeated action performed together. A shared pattern, a familiar sequence, something people return to because it connects them. The people of Göbekli Tepe may have understood this instinctively. They did not need written doctrine. They did not need permanent institutions. The gathering itself was enough. Every return reinforced memory. Every gathering strengthened identity. Every shared experience became part of a larger tradition. Traditions survive because they are repeated, not because they are explained. This distinction is important. Modern society often records information in writing. Knowledge exists outside the individual, stored in books, databases, archives. For the people of Göbekli Tepe, knowledge lived within people themselves. Memory carried it. Conversation carried it. Experience carried it. When communities gathered, memory gathered with them. Stories moved from one generation to the next. Skills were demonstrated. Lessons were shared. History remained alive because people embodied it. The hill may have functioned as a meeting point for this process. Not merely a location, a living archive, a place where memory could be renewed before dispersing once more across the landscape. This idea helps explain why permanence mattered. The pillars remained even when people departed. When visitors returned months later, the same stones greeted them. The same enclosures, the same forms. Memory acquired physical anchors. The landscape itself began participating in remembrance. Ritual does not always require words. Consider a fire at night. People gather around it. They sit quietly. They watch the flames. No explanation is necessary. The experience itself creates connection. Göbekli Tepe may have operated in a similar way. The pillars did not need to communicate specific messages. Their presence shaped behavior naturally. They created atmosphere, focus, awareness. The space itself encouraged a different state of mind. Imagine entering an enclosure at dawn. The morning air still cool, the stone pillars rising around you, shadows stretching across the ground, birds moving above the hill. Everything feels familiar, yet different from ordinary life. You are no longer traveling, no longer hunting, no longer gathering resources. For a brief moment, attention shifts. The place itself becomes the activity. This may be one of the earliest examples of humans creating dedicated ceremonial space, not for practical survival, for shared experience. That possibility carries enormous significance. because it suggests something profound about human nature. People do not gather only to solve problems. They gather to create meaning, to reinforce relationships, to remember who they are. The builders of Göbekli Tepe understood this long before civilization emerged. They invested effort not only in survival but in connection. That investment may have changed history. Some researchers have proposed a fascinating possibility. Perhaps gatherings of this scale eventually encouraged agriculture. Traditional narratives assume farming came first. Large gatherings came later. Göbekli Tepe suggests the reverse might be possible. If communities gathered regularly, they would require reliable food supplies. Reliable food encourages cultivation. Cultivation eventually becomes agriculture. Agriculture transforms society. The sequence remains debated. No definitive answer exists. Yet the possibility itself is remarkable. What if ritual helped create civilization? What if the desire to gather came before the desire to settle permanently? What if cooperation itself became the foundation upon which later societies were built? Göbekli Tepe does not answer these questions. It merely allows them. The site invites reflection rather than certainty. Its greatest lesson may not concern what happened there. It may concern why people came together at all. The need for connection, the need for belonging, the need to share experience. These impulses remain familiar even today. Thousands of years separate us from the builders, yet their gatherings feel strangely recognizable. People still travel long distances to meet one another. People still create traditions. People still return to meaningful places. The forms have changed. The impulse has not. As night settled over the ancient hill, fires would have flickered among the stones. Voices would have risen and fallen. Stories would have passed between generations. Children would have listened. Elders would have remembered. Communities would have gathered beneath the stars. Then, eventually, the gathering would end. People would depart. The fires would fade. The hill would become quiet once more. Yet the memory would remain, carried across the landscape until the next return. And so the cycle continued, year after year, generation after generation, until one day something changed. The gatherings slowed. The enclosures were no longer expanded. And eventually, one of the most surprising decisions in human history began. The people who had raised the stones started burying them, carefully, deliberately, stone by stone. To understand why, we must now turn to the final great mystery of Göbekli Tepe. For generations, people came to Göbekli Tepe. They gathered beneath the open sky. They raised pillars. They carved animals into stone. They returned season after season, century after century. The hill became part of their world. And then something unexpected happened. The process did not end with destruction. It did not end with abandonment. It ended with burial. At first glance, this may not sound extraordinary. Ancient structures disappear all the time. They collapse. They erode. They are dismantled and reused. But Göbekli Tepe followed a different path. The enclosures were not left to decay. They were deliberately filled, stone by stone, layer by layer. Human hands buried what human hands had built. This is one of the most remarkable aspects of the entire site. Building Göbekli Tepe required effort. Burying it required effort as well. Perhaps even more. Imagine standing among the pillars during this final chapter. The stones still rise above the ground. The carvings remain visible. The enclosures still define space. Nothing appears broken. Nothing appears damaged. And yet people arrive carrying soil, stone fragments, and debris. Slowly, the spaces begin to fill. The lower portions of the pillars disappear first, then more, then more. Year after year, the visible world shrinks, until eventually the great figures vanish beneath the earth. The process feels almost ceremonial, not because we possess evidence of ceremony, but because the burial was clearly deliberate. The builders did not simply walk away. If abandonment had been the goal, they could have left. Doing nothing would have required far less effort. Instead, they chose involvement. They chose action. They chose closure. Why? That question has fascinated archaeologists for decades, and the honest answer remains frustratingly simple. We do not know. The stones provide no explanation. No inscription records the decision. No voice survives to tell us what happened, yet uncertainty does not prevent reflection. Several possibilities have been proposed. One interpretation suggests protection. Perhaps the builders wanted to preserve the enclosures. By covering them, they shielded the pillars from weather and erosion. The carvings would remain intact beneath the earth, protected from time. It is an appealing idea. After all, the remarkable state of preservation at Göbekli Tepe exists largely because of burial. The soil became a protective blanket, a barrier between the monuments and the outside world. Yet protection raises its own questions. Protection for whom? For future generations. For themselves. For reasons we can no longer understand. The evidence remains silent. Another possibility is closure. Perhaps the enclosures had completed their purpose. Perhaps a cycle had ended. The people who gathered here may have felt no need to keep the structures visible forever. Modern society often values preservation. We build museums. We restore monuments. We fight against decay. The builders of Göbekli Tepe may have viewed things differently. Perhaps completion mattered more than permanence. Perhaps ending something properly was more important than keeping it visible. This possibility feels surprisingly human. Many traditions throughout history involve closure. Objects are retired. Buildings are abandoned. Sacred spaces are transformed. Not because they failed, because their role has ended. The burial of Göbekli Tepe may represent something similar, a conclusion rather than a catastrophe. What makes this interpretation compelling is the absence of violence. Nothing suggests panic. Nothing suggests invasion. Nothing suggests disaster. The pillars were not smashed. The carvings were not defaced. The enclosures were not burned. Everything points toward patience, toward care, toward intention. The people responsible seem to have acted calmly, and calm decisions often reveal confidence. Confidence that the work was complete. Confidence that nothing remained unfinished. Confidence that the hill could finally rest. There is another possibility as well. Perhaps the burial reflected change. The world around Göbekli Tepe was not static. Climate continued evolving. Communities continued adapting. New forms of life emerged. Agriculture spread. Permanent settlements became increasingly common. Human society transformed. Ideas transformed with it. The needs of one generation are not always the needs of the next. What once felt essential may eventually feel distant. What once united people may eventually be replaced by something new. Perhaps Göbekli Tepe belonged to a world that was slowly disappearing. Not through collapse, through evolution. The builders may have recognized this. The hill had served its purpose. The gatherings had changed. The old rhythms were fading. A new world was emerging. And rather than destroying the past, they chose to place it gently beneath the earth. If this interpretation is correct, the burial becomes even more moving. It was not an act of forgetting. It was an act of respect, a farewell, a transition, a way of acknowledging that one chapter had ended while another was beginning. Yet perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the burial is what it reveals about time. Modern people often imagine history as a straight line, forward movement, continuous progress, endless accumulation. The builders of Göbekli Tepe may have understood time differently, not as a line, but as a cycle. Things begin, they flourish, they conclude, and then something new appears. Within such a worldview, burial makes sense. Completion does not require destruction. It requires acceptance. The enclosures had stood for centuries. They had fulfilled their role. Now they could rest. This idea echoes throughout the site. The pillars themselves never demanded explanation. The carvings never declared their meaning. The gatherings left no written instructions, and the burial left no final message. Everything about Göbekli Tepe resists certainty, yet certainty may never have been the point. The people who built these monuments did not leave answers. They left traces, and among those traces, the burial remains the most powerful of all, because it reminds us that not every ending is dramatic. Some endings arrive quietly, without conflict, without tragedy, without spectacle. The great pillars did not fall. They were lowered into memory. The enclosures did not vanish. They were allowed to sleep. For thousands of years, the hill kept its secret. Rain fell, grass grew, empires rose and disappeared. Entire civilizations passed across the landscape, and beneath them all the stones waited. Not for discovery, not for recognition, simply waiting. Until one day the earth opened once more, and the silent figures returned to the light. Their long sleep ended, but the mystery remained. Perhaps it always will, and perhaps that mystery is not a problem to solve. Perhaps it is the final gift Göbekli Tepe offers to the modern world, a reminder that some things can be completed without being explained. Some places can be important without declaring why, and some endings can be beautiful precisely because they leave room for silence. The builders buried their monuments, but they did not bury the questions. Those questions remain with us still, waiting quietly among the stones. For more than 11,000 years, Göbekli Tepe remained silent, not because it had nothing to say, but because it never learned the language we expected. There are no inscriptions here, no names, no kings, no victories recorded in stone, no stories arranged in sequence, no clear beginning, no clear ending, only pillars, animals, space, and time. The modern mind finds this difficult. We are accustomed to explanations. We want to know who built something, why they built it, what they believed, what happened next. We search for answers because answers create certainty. Certainty creates comfort. A solved mystery feels complete. An explained monument feels familiar. Göbekli Tepe offers neither, and perhaps that is why it continues to fascinate us. The site refuses to become simple. Every discovery answers one question and creates several more. The deeper archaeologists dig, the larger the mystery becomes. Not because evidence is missing, but because the evidence points toward a world fundamentally different from our own. A world that did not organize itself around writing. A world that did not preserve meaning through documents. A world that did not feel obligated to explain itself to the future. The people who gathered here left no message for us. This realization can feel disappointing at first. We want a final revelation, a hidden key, a moment where everything suddenly makes sense. But perhaps that expectation belongs to us rather than to them. Perhaps the builders never intended to leave answers. Perhaps they believed experience mattered more than explanation. The stones suggest this possibility. They do not teach. They do not persuade. They do not command. They simply exist. Generation after generation, people returned to them. Not because the pillars explained anything, because they created a place where people could gather. A place where memory could return. A place where human beings could briefly step outside ordinary life. And perhaps that was enough. Throughout this journey, we have encountered many questions. Why this hill? Why these animals? Why these figures? Why gather here? Why bury it? The questions remain, yet something interesting happens when we stop demanding answers. The sight becomes calmer. The pressure begins to fade. Göbekli Tepe no longer feels like a puzzle waiting to be solved. It feels like a place waiting to be experienced. This distinction changes everything. Not every meaningful thing in life arrives with explanation. Some experiences resist summary. Some memories remain important even when their details disappear. Some places stay with us long after we leave them, despite our inability to explain exactly why. Göbekli Tepe belongs to that category. Its importance may not lie in what it tells us. It may lie in what it reminds us, that human beings have always gathered, always searched for connection, always created meaning together. Long before cities, long before governments, long before written history, people looked toward the horizon, traveled familiar paths, and met one another beneath open skies. The desire was ancient even then, and it remains ancient now. Perhaps that is why the site feels strangely familiar. The builders lived in a world we can barely imagine, yet some part of their experience remains recognizable. The need to belong, the need to remember, the need to return. Across thousands of years, those impulses remain unchanged. The stones endure as witnesses to that continuity, not because they explain it, because they embody it. As evening settles once more over the hill, the landscape grows quiet. The shadows lengthen. The wind moves gently through the grass. The pillars stand where they have stood for millennia, patient, unhurried, unconcerned with interpretation. The modern world continues around them. Cars move along distant roads. Satellites cross the night sky. Information travels instantly across the planet. Yet here, among the stones, another rhythm still lingers, older, slower, more patient. A rhythm shaped not by clocks, but by return. Imagine standing there one final time. The sun has nearly disappeared beyond the horizon. The air has cooled. The carvings grow softer in the fading light. The foxes, the birds, the snakes, the silent figures, everything becomes quieter, less defined, more distant. The details begin to dissolve. Only the feeling remains. A hill, a gathering place, a memory carried across generations. For thousands of years, people came here. They arrived. They gathered. They shared experiences. And then they left. The stones remained. Eventually, even the stones disappeared beneath the earth. Then they returned once more, not because they demanded attention, because time allowed it. Perhaps that is the final lesson of Göbekli Tepe. Not every mystery exists to be solved. Not every silence exists to be broken. Some places ask nothing from us except patience. Some questions remain valuable precisely because they remain unanswered. The builders of Göbekli Tepe may never tell us exactly what they believed. They may never reveal why they chose this hill. They may never explain why they covered the pillars and walked away. And that is all right. The absence of certain does not diminish the sight. It deepens it. Because uncertainty leaves room for wonder. And wonder is often where understanding begins. Now the hill grows dark, the sky fills with stars, the same stars that watched over the first gatherings, the same stars that watched the pillars rise, the same stars that watched them disappear beneath the earth. For a brief moment, the distance between past and present feels smaller. The people are gone. The world has changed. Civilizations have come and gone. Yet the hill remains, quiet, patient, waiting for no one, explaining nothing, still standing at the edge of memory, a place that refused to explain itself. And perhaps, because of that, a place we will never stop returning to.